So the title of the book is Alexis in America, a Russian Grand Duke's Tour, 1871 to 72. And so this year and into early next year is the 150th anniversary of this event. Now, when I talk about Alexis, one of the things that people usually ask is why did the Tsar choose to send his son Alexis to the United States, and why at that particular moment? So you can go ahead and click to the next slide, Hannah. And there are some really good reasons that Alexis came to the United States when he did. So as I said, the United States and Russia had a very good relationship in the 19th century. We had an active trade interaction. Of course, in 1867, the United States had bought Alaska from Russia, and that was a good deal for both parties. And some of you may also know that during the Civil War in 1863, Russia had sent a fleet to the United States. And although Russia had its own reasons for doing so, in the United States, in the North at least, that was seen as a sign of support for the Union. And so there were very favorable feelings toward Russia during this time. Alexander II, Alexis's father, had liberated the serfs in 1861, and Lincoln had liberated the slaves in 1863. So the two countries also saw some similarities and some companionship over these shared experiences. And then, of course, there had also been, for those of you who maybe don't know, an assassination attempt against Alexander II. And there was of course, the assassination of Lincoln. So there were some things that also made the two countries feel like they had something in common. In 1871, of course, the Civil War was over. The United States was sort of repairing itself and redefining itself. Russia had also gone through some significant reforms, including the abolition of serfdom. And so it seemed like a good time to redefine and maybe cement that Russian-American friendship. So Alexander II had some very good reasons to want to send a visitor to the United States. The question, of course, is why Alexis? Because Alexis was the fourth son, so he was not the heir to the throne. There were several other children who could have been sent, but Alexander and his wife had a very good reason for wanting to get Alexis out of Russia for a period of time. And this is because Alexis was in love. So Alexis was born in 1850. So in 1871, he was just 21 years old, and he was in love with a much older woman. She's pictured down at the lower right-hand side of this slide. Her name was Alexandra Zhukovskaya. She was descended from Russian nobility. Her father actually was a Russian poet and had been a Russian tutor to the royal family, but she was not nobility. And while it would have been fine for Alexis to have an affair with her once he was happily married and doing his duty to the throne, he could not marry her. He couldn't marry her. He needed to marry somebody from a royal family. But Alexis was quite in love with her, and he wanted to marry her. And in fact, in January of 1871, she was already expecting his child. And so Alexander II and his wife were eager to try and get Alexis to forget this woman, or to at least separate him from her from an extended period of time. And so so it was decided to send Alexis to the United States and on an extended journey to sort of squash this relationship. And Alexis was quite upset about this. He really loved her. He wanted to marry her. He made that very clear in letters to his parents. And as I've told people before, in reading his letters to his parents, it almost felt voyeuristic because the letters were very emotional and they sounded exactly like you would expect them to sound, where a son is pleading with his parents to let him marry the woman that he loves, and telling them that he has this duty to her, and the parents are saying, enough of this, we're tired of talking about it, you can't marry her, you're going to continue to travel, and you're not coming home until you sort of get over this. So there's a really interesting story behind it, and I'll conclude the story at the end of the presentation. So we can move on to the next slide. So even though this was a visit that was intended to redefine and cement Russian-American relations, there were some threats to a good visit. The first was a Polish assassination plot. So before Alexis even arrived in the United States, the Russian minister, who's pictured on the left and whose name is at the bottom, Konstantin Kadakazi, informed our Secretary of State, Hamilton Fish, that he had been told that there was a plot by Polish nationals living in New York City to assassinate Alexis when he arrived in the United States. And there was some significant investigation of this, and they could never really uncover the certainty of a plot, but there was enough evidence about it that it was decided that agents from Pinkerton's detective agency would travel with the Grand Duke for at least part of the trip to ensure his safety. So that was one potential threat. The second potential threat was something called the Perkins claim. And this was a lawsuit filed by an American citizen against the Russian government. It was a claim from a defaulted agreement back from the Crimean War in the 1850s. And over the decades, this man, Perkins, and then ultimately his heirs were attempting to get this matter resolved. And they kept appealing to the United States government to intervene on their behalf. They appealed to the Russian government to settle the claim. And there were some American politicians who took this claim very seriously. And in fact, when it was time for the Alaska purchase, there was a significant movement to try and withhold a certain amount of money from the Alaska payment until the Russian government looked at this claim again. Ultimately, of course, the Alaska sale went through as planned, but it was done so with the promise that the Russian government was going to revisit this issue. And so when the new Russian minister arrived in September of 1869, and that was Konstantin Kadakazi, he was tasked by the Russian government with re-examining this claim. And Konstantin Kadakazi was convinced from the beginning that the claim was false and that it had been exaggerated and that the money was being promised to politicians, or at least part of it was. And that's why there was such a keen interest in it. He even claimed that President Grant was someone who would benefit from the settlement of the claim. And this was only one of a number of things that Kadakazi did to really make himself disliked by the American government. Kadakazi was apparently kind of a prickly individual. He was described by someone as odious and disagreeable, which I think is a phenomenal phrase, the one I hope no one ever uses it about me. And so he became very disliked in the American government. He had a bad habit of somehow getting information into the American newspapers, either by writing articles himself or by talking to reporters. And sometimes these articles were critical of people within the US government or critical of US policy. Sometimes they just seem to be sort of leaking information or misleading or placing misleading information in the newspapers. And so he was seen as a problem. And so it was decided by the early summer of 1871 that he needed to go. And so Hamilton Fish sent a letter to our minister in St. Petersburg requesting that the Russian government recall this minister. And needless to say, that was a kind of a scandalous thing to ask for in the first place, though not unprecedented. But of course, the other problem was that Alexis at this point was already preparing to depart for the United States. He was supposed to leave in August. And so the Russian government made it clear that there was no way that the Grand Duke's visit could proceed if there was no Russian minister present. So it was decided on the part of the United States government that they would tolerate Konstantin Kadakazi until the end of the Grand Duke's visit, but he would be persona non grata, and he would only be allowed to interact with government officials to the degree that it was necessary for the Grand Duke's visit. So this caused, quite a tension and some scandal right before the Grand Duke's visit. There were people who worried that the Grand Duke's visit would be canceled. And ultimately it did sort of cast a pall over the visit when he was in Washington. Okay, so we can go on to the next slide. So this is a map that shows the Grand Duke's travels. He went to over 14 cities, 14 major cities and some small cities within the United States. And he also went to 3 cities in Canada. When I was doing research for this project, I went to every place he went and did research at the local historical societies and public libraries using their primary source collections or document collections, looking at letters. There are still menus and banquet invitations and other things like that that are extant today. And I also looked at newspapers on microfilm from all of these cities from 1871 and 72. So you can imagine this was a fun research project for me. But you can also see that the Grand Duke covered a lot of territory in a 3-month period. And this actually makes his visit unique compared to some other famous visitors in the United States, such as Lafayette or Mark Twain. I'm sorry, not Twain, Dickens. Because although some of these other people came and traveled in the United States, they didn't cover as much territory. And Alexis's visit was designed in such a way that in the major cities, there were these balls and festivities that were really kind of only exclusively for the well-to-do in the city. But because he traveled so much, he was in a lot of parades, and his train, of course, traveled a great deal. And so people came out in droves at all sorts of places to see him. So average folks actually had the opportunity to see the Grand Duke, or at least see his train go by. And this increased public awareness and public interest in this visit in a way that was probably not true for some of those other famous visitors in the 19th century. Lots of people described going out to train depots or along train lines or to the crowded streets in a city to see the Grand Duke go by. And I think that makes this visit particularly interesting as compared to some other events in the 19th century. Next slide. So not surprisingly, the first stop for the Grand Duke's visit was New York City. And in all of the cities, all of the major cities that Alexis visited, of course, he was feted with balls and parades and banquets. And as I said a moment ago, these really were hosted by and designed for the well-to-do in each city. So politicians, businessmen, and then also some other people, sort of, like scientific and literary luminaries of the time, were often involved in the Grand Duke's reception in some way. So in New York City, when he arrived, there was an enormous parade down Broadway. And then during his time there were various banquets and balls and theater performances that were held for him. Next slide. After he went to New York City, where his initial reception was, he then went to DC to meet President Grant and Secretary of State Hamilton Fish. And as I said a few minutes ago, the visit here was quite different, and it was really out of character with the visit in all the other cities. So in Washington, the Grand Duke met the president, Hamilton Fish, other members of the cabinet, and their wives, but there was no ball, there was no dinner, and the speeches were kept to a minimum. So his visit there was definitely negatively impacted by the tensions caused by the Russian minister. The Russian minister was actually present for this, but he was sort of in the background to the extent that that could be possible, because Grant and Fish wanted nothing to do with him. Next slide. The Grand Duke also went to Philadelphia. And here you can see a copy of an invitation at the bottom, a reception invitation. And he stayed at the Continental Hotel in Philadelphia. Here he met other famous politicians and historical figures. One of them was General George Meade, who was the hero of Gettysburg. And as in other cities, he was wined and dined and feted. And I should mention to you that, in all of these cities, of course, the Grand Duke was housed in the best hotel of the city. And the cost of these events was paid for by the citizens of the various cities. So while the reception in DC, minimal as it was paid for by the government, in other cities, it was the citizens who got together And they raised funds through various ways, selling tickets and so on. Sometimes the wealthiest citizens donated carriages and those sorts of things. And in this way, the private citizens of these various cities paid for the Grand Duke's reception. The Grand Duke usually paid for his own hotel bill, however. Next slide. The Grand Duke also went to Boston, and here he visited City Hall, and he visited the Old State House and other famous sites. He visited the Massachusetts Historical Society, and actually on Wednesday this week, I gave a lecture there in person at the Massachusetts Historical Society. And I focused specifically on his visit to Boston because he visited the Massachusetts Historical Society, and there he was shown they presented to the Massachusetts Historical Society with some leaves, some oak leaves. And the story behind this is that years before, Charles Sumner's younger brother had brought an acorn to Russia as a gift, and it was an acorn from the grave, a tree near the grave of George Washington. That acorn was planted in Russia. It grew into a tree. And years later, when Gustavus Vasa Fox was in Russia, he was shown that tree that had resulted from that acorn. And now, years later, Alexis and his traveling companion, the Admiral Konstantin Pasyet, brought with them leaves from that oak tree to present to the Massachusetts Historical Society, and they have those on display right now, as a matter of fact. So that's an interesting kind of connection there. While Alexis was in Boston, there was, of course, a ball and several dinners. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, interestingly enough, was attending several of those events, was in attendance at several of those events, as was Louisa May Alcott. So Louisa May Alcott, who was already a famous author at this point, was at the ball for Alexis. And she made a funny comment about how Alexis was dancing with all the pretty young women, but leaving the old dowagers in the corner. And this is a funny thing, because throughout the Grand Duke's visit, the American press paid a lot of attention to his female dancing partners. There were rumors that Alexis was hunting for a bride in the United States. As we know, that wasn't true. He was still very much in love with Alexandra Zhukovskaya, but you can imagine that, the American public wanted to believe this, and it was a good news story. So all the newspapers constantly talked about who he was dancing with. And of course, in many cities, he was sort of forced to dance with the wives of these politicians and so on, right? Because everybody would want to dance with the young, handsome prince. And there were jokes and references to Alexis not being allowed to choose his own dance partners. So Louisa May Alcott's comment is sort of funny in that context. Next slide. So from Boston, Alexis went north, and here he visited Ottawa, Montreal, and Toronto. And as part of that visit, he also visited Niagara Falls. The descriptions of that are very much like the descriptions of a visit to Niagara Falls today. So, they talk about going under the falls and wearing these special costumes to protect themselves from the water. And of course, it's not surprising that, given the spectacular nature of that location, that Alexis was taken there. Next slide. From Niagara Falls, Alexis went to Buffalo, Cleveland, and Detroit. But the next city on his stop was really much more interesting. Alexis visited Chicago only weeks after the Great Fire. So the Great Fire had happened in early October of 1871. Alexis was in Chicago about 6 weeks later. And it was sort of interesting and amazing that Chicago managed to pull this off. City officials very much wanted to show that they could host the Grand Duke and that Chicago would rebuild itself and be a great city again. And so it was a point of pride. It reminds me of, sort of what happened after Katrina in New Orleans, right? There was this strong feeling that it's important to show the world that we can rebuild and that we will be back to our former greatness. And Chicago had that feeling. So they chose to invite the Grand Duke, and he did decide to go there, and he was brought to tour the burn districts, and Chicago, gave him a good reception, just like many of the other cities. Next slide. From Chicago, Alexis visited Milwaukee. And it's interesting. In Milwaukee, there was actually some opposition to Alexis's visit from German citizens living there. So as I'll sort of talk about at the very end of the presentation, not everyone was thrilled about the Grand Duke coming to the United States, and not everyone was thrilled about any kind of reception for him. Alexis, after all, came from a monarchy. And so there were some questions about why we should be hosting a member of a royal family. After all, the United States was supposed to have created itself to get away from that sort of thing. But for some citizens, especially those who had moved to the United States to get away from repressive governments, they saw it as particularly offensive. And so there were a number of German citizens who had come to the United States after the revolutions of 1848. And so they were not thrilled about the idea of Milwaukee hosting a member of the Russian royal family, which of course represented monarchy. And ultimately their complaints went nowhere, but they were pretty vocal about them. So next slide, please. After Milwaukee, Alexis went to St. Louis. And one of the things I'll mention here is that along the way, Alexis visited not only the social scene of each city, but he also visited engineering and industrial and educational facilities as well. So in Chicago, he had visited a pork packing plant. In other cities, he visited prisons, he visited factories of various sorts. In St. Louis, he visited a famous bridge. And along the way, he expressed interest in these various things. And of course, the city officials were happy to show off their engineering and technical and industrial facilities. But Alexis actually seemed to be interested in these things. And in some places he requested blueprints, in some places he took home samples of items, all with the intent of bringing this information back to Russia for possible use in Russia, or some kind of possible connections between Russia and the United States. In some cases, maybe trade or some kind of other technical purchases. Next slide. The next part of the Grand Duke's visit is actually the one that is probably most known. So people who are very interested in the West, who are interested in Buffalo Bill or Custer, are usually familiar with this part of the Grand Duke's visit. So the Grand Duke went out west and he participated in a buffalo hunt in Nebraska. And there is a very small town named Hays Center, Nebraska, which has about 200 people in it last time I checked. And not far from there is the actual campsite where the Grand Duke's hunt took place. And as I said, participants in that hunt included Buffalo Bill and Custer. So here's where that Russian Forrest Gump thing comes in. And the visit was reported on, the hunt was reported on by a reporter who traveled with them. This is the account that I have used in my book to describe the buffalo hunt, because there are also some very colorful versions that were later published by Buffalo Bill. So of course we have to remember Buffalo Bill was a showman. And so he published his own memoirs, which included accounts of the buffalo hunt several times. And the various versions are not always consistent. And they talk about things like, Alexis not being a very good shot and needing help. This is not very likely. Alexis had already had experience hunting in Russia, so he was likely a very good shot. Certainly he wouldn't have needed help from Buffalo Bill to shoot something as large as a buffalo or bison. But Buffalo Bill tells some very colorful versions of this story. But in any event, the hunt was a great success. The stories from several people say that every time Alexis, shot a buffalo, there would be the popping of champagne corks and the celebration that followed. So people were very happy when Alexis was successful hunting. There was also a visit by some Native Americans who came, from the Brule Sioux tribe. They had been specially invited to come and perform for the Grand Duke because Alexis had expressed interest in seeing Native Americans. And of course, later on, we know that Buffalo Bill would take Native Americans to Russia as part of his traveling Western show. But the visit in the West was very successful. Alexis also went to Denver, where there was a proper hotel and a ball and a dinner and those sorts of things. But the buffalo hunt itself was by far the most colorful part of the Grand Duke's visit, and especially of his visit out West. Next slide. So you can see here, this is an actual picture of Custer with Alexis. And at the bottom of the picture, I think you can see there are some buffalo tails. Next slide. From the West, Alexis went back toward the Midwest and the South. So he visited Louisville, Kentucky, and he actually went inside of Mammoth Cave. Next slide. From there, he traveled to Memphis, where he was hosted at the Peabody Hotel. Unfortunately, it's not the same Peabody that stands today, and the Peabody that stands today seems to have no records of this visit. So I checked; they don't have anything, unfortunately. But while he was in Memphis, of course, there were the requisite balls and banquets. And while he was in Memphis, he met the former Confederate President Jefferson Davis, and his traveling companion, the Admiral, wrote that Jefferson Davis seemed like a nice guy, and that it was hard to imagine that he had been on the quote wrong side of things. Next slide. From Memphis, Alexis traveled by riverboat down to New Orleans. And this is another part of the Grand Duke's visit that is more widely known. It's in New Orleans, in the newspaper every year around Mardi Gras time. There's some mention of Grand Duke Alexis. So Alexis was in New Orleans for the first daytime Mardi Gras celebration. So many of you probably know that Mardi Gras originated in Mobile, and then eventually it made its way to New Orleans. For many years, the celebrations were at night, and they were very unorganized. And so there was no attempt to mandate what people did or how they dressed or that sort of thing. In 1872, an organization was created called the Crew of Rex, which of course is one of the oldest organizations, Mardi Gras organizations in New Orleans. And that year there was an attempt to actually organize a daytime procession with guidelines and expectations. And this occurred in coordination with the Grand Duke's visit. So one of the myths about this is that the Grand Duke inspired all of this. That's actually not really true. It's clear that there was already some interest in organizing Mardi Gras a little more for tourism purposes and other reasons before the Grand Duke's visit to New Orleans. But the fact that he was on the way makes it coincidental and easy to connect the two. The other thing that's interesting that is part of the sort of lore, popular lore about Mardi Gras and Alexis is that the Crew of Rex's theme song is "If Ever I Cease to Love." This song was a song that was being performed in a musical, a burlesque musical called Bluebeard by Lydia Thompson, a woman named Lydia Thompson. It was a very popular song, so people were already very much aware of this song. But there was a rumor in the American press that Alexis had fallen in love with Lydia Thompson because in another city he had seen her perform and given her a lavish bracelet. Now, this was not atypical. Alexis actually gave a lot of fancy gifts while he was traveling through the United States. But as I said before, there was a great interest in the American press and the American public in believing that Alexis was here to find a wife, and that he was, chasing women all over the United States. And so this story about Alexis and Lydia sort of stuck. And so then when Rex chose their theme song, If Ever I Cease to Love, it was said that they chose it as sort of a playful mocking of Alexis when he came to visit. And Lydia Thompson was actually performing in New Orleans around the same time. Again, it's not true, but the myth has persisted. And so every year you'll see something about this in Mardi Gras, in newspapers or on websites regarding Mardi Gras. And although I wrote an article disproving this entire thing, the myth still continues because it's a good story and people would like to believe it. Next part. So not surprisingly, Alexis's visit provoked a lot of interesting reactions. So there was a lot of advertising using Alexis's name. So there were both products and fashions that were created that were named after him. So there was an Alexis hair tonic for sale. There were Alexis shoes for sale. There was a lot of Russian themed jewelry that appeared for sale in newspapers, but also stores would sometimes use Alexis's name as an advertising point. So for example, they would say, men who are going to be going to the Grand Duke Alexis ball should come and get their hats here at our store. Or, Alexis admired this sewing machine and therefore and said he wants to bring one back to Russia. So all of you should come and get a sewing machine here, like the one Alexis admired. So there, and this was, by the way, one of the first times that stores used a celebrity to advertise as opposed to just advertising what their products were. So prior to this, you'd see a store just advertising, we've got these goods. This was actually an attempt to co-opt that excitement of Alexis and use it to sell things. So that's a very interesting thing. There was also a lot of really bad poetry written and published for Alexis's visit. So this is just an excerpt from one poem. I have about 25 of these that I've collected from various newspapers. There were a lot of very bad rhymes made with the name Alexis. So as you can see here, there's a Muscovite youth named Alexis, who an officer first of the deck is, and he came here to see what this country might be, ere I land to his own he annexes. So anything that rhymed with Alexis, including Texas, and any other thing you can think of was jammed into a poem somehow and published in newspapers around the country. And then finally, as I said, there were lots of stories about women chasing Grand Duke Alexis and Alexis being interested in the women. So there were some really kind of embarrassing stories about women following him around the country, or women waiting in the lobby of the hotel he was staying at to try and meet him. The newspapers constantly referred to who Alexis danced with. They referred to the dress of the women at the ball. They talked about, the fact that women were, pestering their fathers to spend lots of money so they could go to this ball and meet the young, handsome Duke. So a lot was made of Alexis as an eligible bachelor. Next slide. One of the most interesting things that I discovered in my research was how the visit has been remembered over time. So one of the things that I discovered, of course, and this is not surprising, that if someone was living in one of the cities where Alexis visited, and they were a letter writer, and of course, lots of people were back then, their letters often mentioned this. So we have letters in various collections around the country where people talk about the Grand Duke's visit. And sometimes it's just in passing, but sometimes it's a little more, especially if they've seen the Grand Duke in a parade, or if they've been lucky enough to attend one of the balls. Even more interesting, I think, is that Alexis's name appeared later in wedding announcements. And what I mean by this is, if a young woman was fortunate enough to dance with Grand Duke Alexis while he was in her city, when she later got married, that was sometimes mentioned in the wedding announcement, which I think is just fascinating. So among the other information about like who the bride's parents were and so on and so forth, they would say, you know, like Miss so-and-so, you know, of this place who's marrying this person danced with Grand Duke Alexis when he was in this city. And I just think that's such an odd thing to add to a wedding announcement, but it really does show what an interesting, what an important thing that was for people at the time. And similarly, later I found mention of Grand Duke Alexis in obituaries. So if a particularly famous caterer or the manager of a hotel had been involved in the Grand Duke's reception, years later when he died, it would be mentioned in the obituary that he had been the host of Grand Duke Alexis, that he had been the person in charge of the reception of Grand Duke Alexis in that city. So I just think those are fascinating cultural signs of just how important Grand Duke Alexis's visit was. Since the visit ended, since, you know, many years after the visit, there have been other ways in which places have attempted to commemorate the visit. So there have been a number of museum exhibits that have talked about the Grand Duke's visit. There have also been commemorative balls and also some commemorative dinners. And in some cases, these dinners have attempted to actually recreate the menu from the dinner. And these menus were quite extravagant and quite abundant. So this is no small feat. But there have been a number of places that have attempted to do that. And then finally, I think this is particularly interesting as well. In 1924, a Mardi Gras organization was founded in New Orleans called the Crew of Alexis. Now, initially, it lasted for only 4 years, and I never could find out why it was disbanded then. But many years later, in 1975, this organization was refounded, I suppose, and it continues to exist to this day. And it's one of the organizations that does not have a parade, but they do have a ball, and the ball is Russian themed. So every year they pick some theme from Russian history, and the participants dress in costumes that are supposed to represent that period in Russian history. And they give away, they call them ball favors. And the ball favor is something related to the Grand Duke Alexis or Russia. So for example, you know, it might be a coin, it might be an ashtray, it might be a wine glass that has something Russian on it, or like an insignia of the Romanov family, something like that. Next slide. Two other indications of how the Grand Duke's visit has been remembered are here on this slide. So on the right-hand side, this is a buffalo head that is on display at the New York Yacht Club. And it is supposedly a buffalo head from the actual buffalo hunt. The story is that after the buffalo hunt, Alexis gave this as a gift to the merchant who had supplied a lot of the goods for the hunt, the food and such that they used while they were out there. And then Alexis, then the merchant held on to the buffalo head for a number of years, and eventually it was donated to the New York Yacht Club, and it hangs in their offices there. At least the last time I visited, it was still there. And on the left is a brochure from something that that existed for 10 years. Unfortunately, it does not occur anymore. And this was something called the Grand Duke Alexis Rendezvous. And it was held in Hayes Center, Nebraska, that tiny town that I mentioned. It was put on by the Lions Club. And it was a 2-3 day event where people would come dressed in costume for the characters who had been part of the buffalo hunt. So you can see the picture there shows the man in the foreground is Grand Duke Alexis. Obviously, the man playing the part was much older than the Grand Duke was at the time, because Alexis turned 22 during the during the buffalo hunt. And in the top photo, you can see the guy who played Buffalo Bill, and there's somebody who played Custer. And then there were other people who came dressed as sort of other, mountain men. And these people would come and they would stay on the premises, and they would camp out for several days, and other people would come as well. Mountain men from the area would travel and come and and camp out there, and they would be dressed in period garb, and they would be cooking over fires and so on. And they would also do presentations where the Grand Duke Alexis and Buffalo Bill and Custer would talk about the hunt in character, and they would attempt to stay in character all weekend long. I actually was fortunate enough to attend this event several times while I was doing research for the book, and it was a lot of fun. And it's really unfortunate that it's not happening anymore. The reality was just that the people who had started hosting it were already pretty old when they started, and by the end they just weren't up to it anymore, and there were no young people in the town who wanted to continue it, and so it's sort of fallen by the wayside. But it was a really amazing event held every year specifically to commemorate this event, and they would take people out to see the actual campsite. There are several markers that show where the actual campsite took place. So unfortunately, it's not going on anymore, but there are still markers to show where the Grand Duke's buffalo hunt took place. Next slide. So just to sort of wrap up the story for you, you probably want to know what happened to Alexis after he left the United States. So while Alexis was traveling through the US, as I said, he was very much in love with Zhukovskaya, and he continued to mourn her absence and mourn his separation from her. And Admiral Posiet, who traveled with him, was constantly reporting back to the Tsar about Alexis's mood. So he wrote letters back to the Tsar telling him Alexis is still crying about Zhukovskaya. He still is very sad about being separated from her. And, you know, I'm quite actually nervous that she might show up in one of these ports. And so I'm on the lookout for this. And so it was decided that Alexis's visit would continue. And so when he left the United States, when he left New Orleans, he stopped in Mobile for just an hour or so. And then he went to Pensacola, where he connected with the Russian fleet. And from there, they went to South America. Eventually, they traveled east. They went as far as Japan before Alexis returned home. And eventually, I hope I'll be able to do research in some of those other parts of Grand Duke Alexis's visit. But it was about 2 years by the time Alexis got back to Russia. Throughout that time he was traveling, however, Admiral Posiet was on alert because he was really worried that Zhukovskaya might show up in one of these ports, or that Alexis might try and meet her somewhere. So it was a very serious thing for the Russian royal family to keep him away from this woman. In the meantime, Zhukovskaya gave birth to his son. Actually, just about the day he was arriving in the United States, she gave birth to his son. She named the child Alexis after his father. Eventually, she took the child and moved to Germany, and she married someone else. But years later, the young Alexis was brought back to Russia, and he actually became a member of the Russian court again. And apparently he was very well treated by the royal family. He was accepted by them. And the last empress, Alexandra, was actually godmother to one of his children. So that shows that he was brought back into the family. I don't know how much contact Alexis, the father, had with his son. I was never able to uncover any connections between them. So I don't know that they had much of a relationship after the young Alexis came back to Russia. Grand Duke Alexis himself, when he returned to Russia in 1873, continued as one of the royal sons to serve in the Navy, as he had for all these years already. He eventually became head of the Russian Navy. Unfortunately, this was not a good thing for Alexis. He really wasn't that interested in the Russian Navy. He wasn't that interested in heading the Russian Navy. And so there were lots of sort of humorous comments about Alexis, that he was more interested in women than ships. He was actually, there was a funny line someone said about him, that he liked fast women and slow ships. And there were other jokes that said that every time Alexis had a new girlfriend, this was bad for the Russian Navy, because the money would be spent on on the girlfriend instead of the Russian Navy. Ultimately, Alexis was still the head of the Navy at the time of the Russo-Japanese War, which is what that poster in the center illustrates. And of course, the Russo-Japanese War was a terrible defeat for Russia. And so Alexis left the Navy somewhat in disgrace, and he moved to Paris, where he died in 1908 of kidney disease. So Alexis had a sad life in the end, I think. He never was reconciled with Zhukovskaya. He never married. He had lots of girlfriends over the years, but he never really settled down. And ultimately he died in Paris in 1908, never having married, and nor had he had any more children. The only positive thing we can say about the fact that Alexis died in 1908 is that he was spared the trauma of the Russian Revolution. So oftentimes people ask me what happened to Alexis during the Russian Revolution. He was actually dead for quite some years before that traumatic event occurred. The photographs on the right are of the building that he lived in Paris. So when I was in Paris a couple of years ago, I tracked down his residence there and had my picture taken in front of it. Next slide. And that is the end of the Grand Duke's story. I'm happy to take any questions at this time.
Here, we have a few questions already from our attendees. And let me see, the very first one I see is from Conrad Phillips, who says, to what extent did the tour succeed? Was it a successful diversion? You kind of answered this a little bit, but if you'd like to elaborate more on this inquiry.
So I think it was a very successful visit. It was very positive in many ways. Unfortunately, this was sort of the highlight of Russian-American relations, because from that point forward, things tended to go downhill. There was, of course, the scandal involving the Russian minister. And then 10 years later, when Alexis's father, Alexander II, was assassinated by terrorists and succeeded by his much more conservative son, it became much more difficult for the United States and Russia to find things in common. And so, from that point forward, Russian-American relations sort of go downhill. But it was a very successful visit in many ways.
All right, thank you. The next inquiry is from Roy, who asks, which languages did Alexis speak during this tour? Was it English, Russian, French, a mixture?
So Alexis spoke English very well. He had been trained to speak English and French and German. And so when he was in the United States, he spoke English when he was interacting with Americans. And several people commented on how good his English was.
All right, thank you. And then two individuals have actually asked very similar questions, so I will put them together. Mark begins by asking, well, why did he go to Canada on this tour? And Carolyn would like to know a few more details about the public engagements in Canada and how he was received there.
Okay, so in Canada, so he was invited to visit Canada. And so that was part of the trip, and it was quite easy to move north from where he was already traveling. And the events in Canada were actually quite subdued compared to the events in the United States, and that is because the Prince of Wales was sick at the time, and he was actually potentially on death's door. And so it was decided that the kind of big celebrations that might have been held should not be held out of respect for that. So the visits in those cities he was taken to the same kinds of places that he was taken in the United States. So he was taken to see, all of the nice facilities, government facilities, that sort of thing. He was taken to see bridges and things like that. Of course, he saw Niagara Falls. But the sort of big balls and celebrations were not held to be out of respect for the illness of the royal family.
Thank you. All right, and now we're getting a few inquiries about the woman here. Yeah. So the first question is actually about, here's another one that just came in. So I'll begin with this one, then we'll get into other inquiries about his love life and marriage and so on and so forth. Lady Agnes writes, since he was such a ladies' man, did he not marry because of his lost love? Could he not find someone the crown would approve of or other?
So I'm sure that there were many opportunities for him to marry. I mean, his family would have wanted him to marry, but he never seemed to be interested in marrying anyone. And I unfortunately, one of the things that I didn't mention in the presentation, but it's relevant here, is Alexis did not write very much. So, for those of you who know something about the Romanovs, you'll know that they were great writers. They wrote lots of letters and they kept lots of diaries. Unfortunately, Alexis was not one of those. So I hunted far and wide, and he has very little writing. So there was one diary that I found, but it went to a period before the visit. So there was no diary that I could find from the visit, nor has anyone else been able to find one. There were letters that he wrote while he was in America. The longest is an 8-page letter to his mother in which he refers to a couple of things along the visit, but it's not very detailed. And I mean, considering the number of places he visited, we would love to know more about what he thought. Some of the letters to his brothers and to his father during the visit were about, how much he was longing for Zhukovskaya and how much he really wished that he would be able to marry her. He describes to his brothers about being lonely and far away from his family at Christmas time and at the time of his birthday, and how he was having to kind of perform at all of these ceremonies, even though he was feeling sad. But he doesn't, I was never able to find any writings from later life that might explain why he never married.
Thank you. So kind of going off of your response here, Ellie would like to know a little bit more about Alexei's temperament. So you spoke very briefly here about how much there is that we don't know. I'm wondering, have you encountered anything describing his temperament from other sources, his own sources? Ellie would like specifically to know if some of Alexei's temperamental personality was perhaps connected to the breakup and its effect on his health.
Interesting. Okay. So I don't know much about his temperament other than the things that I've read in primary sources about him. I mean, by and large, while he didn't have a great reputation as being like a serious leader of the Russian Navy, in other ways, people said nice things about him. They said he was friendly, he was a good dancer, he could sing, that he was pleasant and nice. I mean, on the American visit, everybody wrote nice things about him. In memoirs that I've read where they refer to him, people always had very nice things to say about him, except when it came to his professional life. And it just seemed like, he was sort of, I mean, it just reminds me of so many other royal children who have no real responsibility for so long that when they are given real responsibility, they don't welcome it. Maybe they never really wanted to do it and it's an obligation, or, it's not what they would have chosen for themselves. And so they never kind of put their heart into it 100%. So he kind of just reminds me of another royal child who didn't really get to make all the decisions for his own life that he might have liked to.
Wonderful, thank you. So getting back to this idea of parents and familial influence, Dmitry would like to know, did Alexei's travel influence his father's decision to sell Alaska at all?
So no, because actually the visit comes after the Alaska sale. So the Alaska sale was in 1867, and Alexis's visit came in 1871. The only connection there was that, it was part of that Russian-American relationship that they wanted to really cement and emphasize at the time.
Wonderful. All right. So one more question involving politics from Denise, who would like to ask again, were there any substantive political benefits that accrued directly from the visit?
So there weren't any major political things that occurred as a result of the visit. It was more sort of a friendly relations kind of benefit. And it wasn't 100%. I mean, I said the visit was successful, and it certainly was, but there were some sour grapes from the visit as well. So, the Russian royal family was a little miffed that Alexis wasn't treated better in Washington, D.C., and that was commented on in Russian newspapers. And years later, when President Grant visited Russia, he was not invited to dine. And that was considered to be a direct reflection of his refusal to have a dinner for Grand Duke Alexis, even though the Katakazi thing was certainly a very good and understandable reason. There were still some sour grapes many years later. And there were also the Katakazi thing also seemed to cause some tension for American businessmen. So our representatives in St. Petersburg said, like, there are some people here are kind of angry about the way the United States treated Alexis and Katakazi. And so, businessmen are having trouble getting contracts and so on.
All right, so now we have a question from Daria here. So she asks, was the Grand Duke's son allowed to keep his title? Was he adopted by the husband? You get into this a little bit during the lecture, but overall, do you have any information on what became of his children and grandchildren? Are there other sources you could point to direct some of our audience members who are wondering what happened to that son, Alexis the Younger, or however we would like to call him?
So, as I said, he returned to Russia. He became part of the Russian family again. He married and had children. He actually has descendants living in France and the United States. So I was able to meet and interview one of his, I guess, great granddaughters in the United States, in New York City. I'm not sure if she's still alive because I haven't been in communication with her in a number of years, and she was already very old when I spoke with her. She told me that there were other members of the family out there, but none of them are particularly interested in this story. It is interesting to note that she believed, and she said members of her family believed that Alexis and Zhukovskaya were secretly married. And so that all of the children and grandchildren from that union then would have been legitimate. And so again, there were rumors that they somehow secretly got married, but it's never been proven. But descendants apparently believe that they were actually married.
Plenty more to catch up on, things to read, and things to see. So I'll wish you all a very happy and safe holiday season, and we will hopefully see you in 2022. One final round of virtual applause for Lee, and have a good rest of your weekend, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye. Thank you so much.